All right, welcome back everyone for another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something that honestly I don't think gets enough attention,
Yeah.
especially if you are at all involved in the world of construction. We're going to be taking a deep dive into the world of intellectual property rights when it comes to construction contracts.
Very important.
So, when we talk about intellectual property, we're talking about
Hmm.
a lot of different things, right? We're talking about the designs, the
Yeah,
plans, even digital models these days, things like BIM,
absolutely.
stuff that you might not really think about too much
Right.
in terms of who owns it and who can use it.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
so why should our listeners care about this?
Well, I think it's important for everyone involved in the construction process to understand, what their rights are
Yeah.
and what the limitations are in terms of using these designs. Because it can get quite complicated, especially as you mentioned, with the introduction of digital models and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Like, if you're an architect, you've put your heart and soul into a design,
Right.
you want to make sure that you are protected.
Yeah.
Or if you are the client commissioning a building,
Yeah.
you need to understand what you can and can't do with those blueprints.
Absolutely.
So to kind of guide us on this journey today,
Hmm.
we are going to be looking at some excerpts from CCDC contracts,
All right.
which are the Canadian Construction Documents Committee contracts,
That's right.
which are pretty much the industry standard here in Canada.
Pretty much. Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe just to start off, can you give us an idea why these contracts are so important and why we should be paying attention to them when we're talking about intellectual property rights?
Well, they provide a really valuable framework for everyone involved
Yeah.
in the project to navigate these issues.
Okay.
They set out the ground rules for who owns what, who can use it, how it can be used.
Mhm.
And it really helps to prevent misunderstandings and disputes down the line. So you can imagine, if a client wants to make some changes to a building. Yeah.
5 years down the road, and they don't have a clear understanding of who owns the intellectual property rights to those designs.
Oh, yeah.
That could become a real mess.
That would be a nightmare.
Absolute.
Okay, so let's break it down then, Amy.
Yeah.
If we're talking about a building design, who actually owns that intellectual property?
Well, in most cases, it's the creator.
Okay.
So that would be the architect, the engineer, whoever actually developed those designs. It's kind of like, if a musician writes a song,
Right.
they own the copyright to that song.
Okay.
So it's a similar concept.
So that means they have control over how that work is used, copied, distributed.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, but obviously the clients paying for these designs, they must have some rights to actually use them.
Of course, of course. And that's where licensing comes in.
Okay.
So typically, CCDC contracts will grant the client a license to use the designs.
Okay.
But it's important to note that that license is usually limited.
To that specific project. That's outlined in the contract. So they can use the blueprints to build the building. They can use them for maintenance, repairs, but they can't just take those designs and, go build another building.
So, like, let's say they love the design.
Yeah.
And they're like, you know what, I want to build this exact same thing
Yep.
as my vacation home somewhere else.
Yeah.
Are they out of luck?
Most likely,
Huh?
yes.
Okay.
They would probably need to go back to the original designer, negotiate some sort of additional agreement, potentially purchase broader usage rights. It really depends on the specific circumstances.
And this is where things, I imagine, get even more complicated, right?
They do.
When we start talking about BIM, building information modeling.
Absolutely.
Because now we're not just talking about a static blueprint.
Right.
We're talking about a whole virtual world.
It is, yeah. It's a dynamic digital representation of the building. So it includes everything from the architectural details to the engineering systems. You can even have cost data embedded in there. And quite often you have multiple different firms that are all contributing to one single BIM model.
Right.
So then the question of ownership becomes even trickier.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got all these different people contributing to one model, who gets to say, what's mine? Who gets to make decisions on what happens with that model?
That's a great question. And that's where the CCDC contracts try to provide some clarity.
Okay.
So they'll outline very specific guidelines on who can access the data, who can share it, who has the right to modify it. And this is really important for making sure that everyone's contributions are protected, but also that everyone can still collaborate effectively.
Okay, so like give me for instance, like how would that work in a real world scenario?
Sure. So let's say you have a mechanical engineer
Okay.
who designs, a really complex ventilation system, and they do all of this work within the BIM model.
Okay.
So it's not just visually represented there, but there's also all sorts of, calculations and data and proprietary information that's embedded within that model.
Right. So it's almost like a digital fingerprint.
Exactly. That's unique to their design. And the contract basically helps to ensure that, someone can't just come along, copy and paste that design and use it in another project without permission.
Right, because that is their intellectual property.
It is, yeah.
And it's not just about ownership either, right? We have to think about data security.
Absolutely.
Because these models contain so much sensitive information. If you think about all the different components of a building, the materials, the costs, the timelines, that's all valuable information that needs to be protected.
And that's where those data security clauses in the CCDC contracts come in.
Okay.
So they'll often specify, what kind of security measures need to be in place, who's responsible for maintaining those measures, and really just making sure that that information is kept safe and used only for its intended purpose.
So it sounds like, when you've got so many different players involved, architects, engineers, subcontractors, having those really clear IP clauses in the contract is absolutely essential.
Absolutely. It's all about setting those expectations up front and making sure everyone's on the same page from the very beginning so that you can avoid those disputes.
And we should say, right, like CCDC contracts are a great starting point.
Yeah.
But there might be other relevant legislation or industry standards that need to be taken into account as well, depending on the specific project.
Right.
But I think the CCDC contracts provide a really good kind of foundation for understanding those basic principles.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, I don't know about you, but I find this stuff super fascinating.
I do too.
It really does make you realize that there's this whole invisible world behind the buildings that we see every day. Like these intellectual property rights, they really are the scaffolding.
They are, yeah.
That supports the entire construction process. So to wrap things up, I think the big takeaway here is that understanding intellectual property is non-negotiable. In the world of construction, it's about protecting creative work. It's about fostering collaboration. And ultimately, it's about ensuring that projects run smoothly.
Well said. I agree.
But here's a final thought for everyone listening. With technology evolving as quickly as it is, how are these contracts going to need to adapt? Are we going to see new clauses that address things like AI-generated designs or the use of virtual reality and augmented reality in construction? Lots to think about. But thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of intellectual property and construction.
My